Hello, and welcome back to Monster Week 2026. In case you missed my first video on Monday, Monster Week is an annual community event created and organized by Pointy Hat and Ginny D to help build community in the TTRPG space on YouTube. This year's theme is Fey, perhaps the most complex creature type in all of D&D. In my earlier video, we talked about how this complexity affects planning a narrative around Fey, namely that it makes it difficult. And then we also explore some of the reasons why you might want to use Fey in your story, whether you're a player or a DM. Today, we will talk about how to effectively use Fey. And I think the best analogy to help you better understand how to use Fey effectively in a story is to understand how to use the one, the only, Superman. Part 1. Establishing the analogy. Okay, just hear me out. Superman is the perfect analogy for how to write Fey. Everyone knows him. There's a ton of different versions of them. They have a lot of weird inconsistencies in their powers. But most importantly, a lot of people that use them in their story really struggle with how to do it well. And I'm not the only one that thinks that about Superman.
Superman is I'm sure you'll get into this, but he's such a complicated character to work with because he is such he's not a blank slate, but he's such like an open realm of possibilities that it's like, what direction do I go in? Where with some characters where like their backstory is very prescribed, their personality is very prescribed. It's like, okay, I know what to do with them. But with Superman, the possibilities are so numerous that it gets tricky to write him well.
Superman is indeed a complicated figure who is deceptively simple.
Complicated character, open realm of possibilities, no clear direction to take the story because there are too many options. Sounds a lot like the same problem we have with Fey. So, let's look at the common mistakes writers make with Superman stories. Then, we can use that to uncover the mistakes people make when using Fey. So, it turns out a lot of stories about Superman struggle to actually be good stories. This is usually because the writers either A, drift away from why Superman should be used in a story by butchering his moral code or only really using him as a strong guy to show how strong the bad guy is, or B, the writers fail to realize how to make the story good. They end up using conflicts that have no way Superman should ever lose, so we never get invested, or worse, they create conflicts that only exist because everyone is acting like an idiot and jumping to conclusions. This confusion on how to use the character is exactly the problem Fey present in D&D. It's easy to drift away from why Fey are good to use, and a lot of people don't know how to utilize the interesting aspects of Fey to make a story. So, continuing with the analogy of Superman being similar to Fey, if we can figure out how to effectively use Superman in a story, we should be able to figure out how to effectively use Fey in a story. Part 2. How to effectively use Superman. When is a Superman story actually good? Superman is at his best when there's tension in a story, a genuine concern over whether or not he can succeed. When trying to understand tension, it might help to picture a rope. When you have a conflict of some kind, and there's two forces working against each other, the rope pulls taut, and there's tension there. It's the same narrative, which means if there isn't a conflict of some kind, if there's no real problem, then there's no real tension, and the rope is going to be slack. Tension is hard to create, but it can be easy if you remember this guideline. Tension can only exist when the audience understands the problem, the audience believes it is genuinely possible the character might not succeed, and the audience cares if the character succeeds. For example, there's a story about Alexander the Great, known as the Gordian Knot. The story goes, a king tied an intricate knot, and it was foretold that whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. For generations, countless people tried and failed to unravel this knot. Alexander, wanting to prove himself a conqueror, decides to attempt to untie the knot. This seems like a great example of how to make tension. There is a clear problem, untie the impossible knot, and the audience believes it's possible for him to fail due to generations of others failing before him. And lastly, the people the story was told to were the people Alexander ruled over, so they would not want their ruler to fail and look like an idiot. The problem is this story isn't being told to be a good story. It's being told about Alexander the Great to justify his conquering and make him seem cool. Instead of an ending with him solving the knot, Alexander simply cuts through it, and in doing so, cuts through any tension that was in the story. Doing this is even worse than not having tension in the first place, because you undercut the tension. When you undercut your tension like this, when you make your audience understand a problem, make them believe it's possible to lose, and make them care if the character succeeds, only to introduce something they didn't understand or ignore the problem entirely, you leave them disappointed. They were waiting for the things you introduced to become relevant, and you left them hanging for it. Undercutting the tension like this makes it to where people don't want to keep going. Why should they care? Why should they think about the story at all? You're just going to undercut the tension anyway. Now that we understand what tension is, and that it's the key aspect to telling a good Superman story, we now return to the question, When is a Superman story actually good? The answer is when Superman is put into emotional or ethical conflicts, not logic-focused conflicts or plots that focus on him pushing his limits. Superman works best when he has to make an emotional connection with someone to resolve the conflict. And this is doubly true when he has to overcome someone's preconception of how could someone as perfect and powerful as Superman understand me? When you put Superman in a situation he can't punch through, a situation where his powers don't do anything to stop the problem, then you're able to pin down how to most effectively use him in the story. The pinnacle example of a problem he can't solve with his powers is when Superman is put into a trolley problem situation. Essentially, does he save the world or does he save a few people in front of him right now? What makes trolley problem stories interesting is that a choice has to be made. You can't have both. Everyone inherently understands that if you chose both and still succeeded, it would completely undercut the tension and make for an awful story. Except, Superman can choose both, because he is Superman. With any other character, it feels cheap and unearned if they are able to subvert the trolley problem scenario and save everyone. But with Superman, it doesn't feel like undercutting the tension because we know, before we even start the story, who Superman is. As a side note, trolley problems are also interesting in D&D because, no matter the outcome, the tension isn't eroded due to the fact that success or failure comes down to a dice roll. But we'll talk more about tension in its own video. The other reason Superman can choose both is because he still faced the conflict. A good Superman story uses the tone, point of view, and theme to build the tension not on what Superman can do, but on the choice Superman can't make, choosing one life over another. Superman still struggled with the conflict, he still considered both options, he was being pulled in two directions. Heck, the best version of Superman being put into a trolley problem is when he's able to pick both, not because Superman could do anything, but because Superman inspires others to do things he could not do alone. The best Superman stories, the ones that use Superman effectively, are the ones that focus on his limitations rather than his powers, and the ones that resolve the conflict through his moral strength, not his physical strength. The reason those are the best Superman stories is because they make use of the most important thing for a good story, especially when dealing with creatures known to have weird powers beyond comprehension. And that thing that makes these the best stories is tension. The stories that effectively use Superman create tension by focusing in on one aspect, Superman's morals, and spend time to make sure we understand his morals super well. Think about it. These stories focus in on one specific aspect of Superman, his morals, to ensure the audience understands why this is a problem. Good stories set up a situation where Superman's morals are put to the test, where he can obviously fail because it's not about whether or not Superman is powerful enough. It's about whether or not he will make the right choice. And lastly, these stories present his motivations and reasons for having those morals in the first place. They do this to help the audience care if he succeeds. There's so many aspects of Superman you could talk about, but that focus on one particular aspect is how you effectively use Superman in a story. Part 3. How to use Fey. The stories Fey work best in aren't the same ones as Superman, but the way to find out how to use Fey effectively is the same, and that's tension with payoff. Now, the first step in using Fey effectively is to focus. What do I mean by that? Firstly, how effective Fey are in a narrative is entirely determined by how well people understand the Fey. And the best way to help people understand Fey is to have a really narrow focus. This allows us to give a clear understanding of Fey without obstructing that chaotic nature to them. So, pick one specific Fey, or heck, one specific trait of Fey. The more narrow and clearly understood, the better. Because, to keep tension when using Fey, and provide a payoff to that tension, you are limited by how well the others at your table understand that specific aspect of Fey that you chose to focus on. If the others at the table don't understand what you chose to focus on, if there aren't clear mechanics, or at least consistent patterns when you engage with the Fey, then there is no tension. When you establish one clear thing about Fey, and you are consistent with it, then you can successfully establish payoff. For example, let's say we focus on how Fey love to make magical deals. This creates a lot of tension whenever you're interacting with Fey, but it's honestly too vague still. It leaves things far too open-ended to be fun to engage with. It still feels like certain things can be chosen to count as a deal, but other things didn't count as a Fey deal. For example, is there a difference between a warlock making a pact with an archfey for power and someone agreeing to give a flower crown to a pixie in a throwaway moment of roleplay? We don't know because there hasn't been a clear limitation on what counts as a Fey deal. And that brings us to the second step in using Fey effectively. What Fey can't do is more interesting than what they can do. If you focus on what Fey can do, the number of things you could choose to focus on becomes overwhelming, and you'll start having issues where your ideas for the narrative begin causing conflicts with the mechanics of the game. However, focusing on what Fey can't do is much easier. Fey can do so many things, but when you give a clear thing they cannot do, then you give your players something they can interact with. They can use the thing Fey can't do to their advantage. They can plan around it. It creates this tension by showing the contrast of all the vague, mysterious powers that the Fey are capable of, and this one specific limitation that the players know about. If we look back at the things that are needed for tension, we can see that focusing on what Fey can't do checks all of the boxes. First, the players understand the limitations of Fey. Second, the problem of how powerful and dangerous Fey are makes the player believe it's genuinely possible their character might not succeed, despite understanding the Fey's limitations. Third, the player will care if their character succeeds, because you've established the limitations in a way that presents a clear path to victory, like watching someone cross a tightrope, regardless of whether they succeed or fail. As long as the players clearly understood one of the Fey's limits, and those limits stay consistent, then that tension will have a payoff. So, rather than saying Fey make magic deals, say deals made with Fey can't be broken, not even by Fey themselves. And that example brings us to the third step of how to effectively use Fey, and it's potentially the most important. Expand on what you've already established instead of introducing something new. The hardest part of using Fey is essentially that they are ADHD bait. If you are not careful, you'll just end up falling down the rabbit hole going,
"Ooh, piece of candy,"
the whole time. You'll introduce a second limitation on Fey, in addition to the fact that they can't break deals. It'll be that they can't lie. Then you'll give a third limitation. They can't touch cold iron. Then a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. Every new thing you introduce makes all the previous ones that much less interesting. Instead of creating something new, clarify what you already have. Fey can't break deals, but they can trick you into thinking they made a deal when they haven't technically. In actuality, Fey can't break deals only if it was explicitly referred to as a bargain. That's a way to expand on the concept. Taking it a step further, you could say a hag is an exception to that rule. They can't break bargains, but only with other hags. Except they can break bargains with hags if they were crossing their fingers when the bargain was made. If you build on what you already have before making something new, it encourages and rewards engaging with the cool thing you've established, as opposed to using it for one session and then immediately peeling off to chase the next limitation and never coming back to what you established. That teaches players that there's no point in putting energy into the things you establish, because it's not going to be relevant again. This third step, expanding on what you already have, is crucial, because otherwise, each time you introduce a new thing, the tension and payoff will be lessened, because it will just feel like another thing about Fey and not the important thing about Fey. Part 4. Superman and Fey. So the way to use Fey effectively is similar to how to use Superman effectively. In order to tell an interesting story for either one, you need to focus on their limitations to create tension, and then explore those limitations to create payoff. That's all well and good to say, but it feels really abstract without actually seeing how it's done. If only we had a short, clear example to demonstrate how both Fey and Superman stories create tension through their limitations. Huh? What's that?
Superman, I'm Mr. Mxyzptlk, an interdimensional peacekeeper, and I need your help.
So, spoilers for the show My Adventures with Superman, but in episode 7, we get the perfect example of limitations for both Superman and Fey. If you didn't know, Superman has an antagonist known as Mxyzptlk. Basically, a Fey creature that seems to be able to do almost anything. As an antagonist, he works perfectly to give clear limitations to Superman. He is something that Superman's powers don't have the ability to overcome.
How did you... Was I a crab?
Every time Superman has an encounter with Mxyzptlk, the story focuses on both of their limitations. For Superman, he is left with only his wits, since Mixie can use magic to break reality, while Mxyzptlk has certain strange, arbitrary limitations that change from encounter to encounter. Sometimes it's that if he says his name backwards, he is banished. In the recent animated show, it's that he can't use his powers without his hat. But something the writers always do with Mxyzptlk is clearly establish his limitations. In these stories, the tension is built from how specific the limitation is. But just because the limitation is specific, that doesn't mean it has to be easy. Getting someone to say their name backwards is hard enough, but someone with the name Mxyzptlk, I can barely say it forwards. And yeah, getting the hat off the head of a little imp sounds easy enough for Superman, until he does this. Superman almost always solves this problem in the same way. He turns Mxyzptlk's whimsical, arrogant attitude into his own undoing, instead of trying to be strong enough to defeat him.
But I am strong enough for one last trick.
Superman focuses on what is perhaps the single best thing to focus on with Fey. their nature. And that's the secret to how to effectively use Fey. Focus on their nature. Identify some trait or ability that is inherent to the identity of being a Fey, and then explore it in detail. And that is exactly what I will be doing in my third video of this year's Monster Week. Looking at the most popular Fey in D&D, exploring their origins prior to D&D, how they are used in D&D, and what the juxtaposition of those things tells us about that Fey's nature. No more broad explanations of why or how to use Fey. We will be exploring exactly what makes Fey so good for stories. But to hold you over till then, I've once again got a small handout to help you pin down how exactly you would use Fey in your story. You can find it in the description below, and once again, it's 100% free. Something else I'm doing again is shouting out FableHollow Coffee and Bookshop, the Fey-themed coffee and bookstore in Knoxville, Tennessee. They have fantastic drinks, an in-store selection of books they cater, and several places you can sit and stay comfortably. Whether you're local or not, you can buy ebooks and audiobooks to get some examples of Fey traits being explored in stories. They are not paying me to say this. Their website and social are also linked down in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all Friday. Bye-bye!